What drives someone to kill? It's a question both psychiatrists and true crime enthusiasts have been asking for years, and the answer still isn't 100% clear. But perhaps an even darker question is, what drives a person to commit mass murder? The killing of dozens or even hundreds of people at one time is a pretty frightening concept, because you never know when you might cross paths with a mass murderer at exactly the wrong time. Unfortunately, this happened to a group of 44 people all the way back in 1955. This is the story of Jack Graham. Jack Gilbert Graham was born on January 23, 1932, in Denver, Colorado. His father died when he was 3, and in the midst of the Great Depression, his mother, Daisy, struggled to raise him and his sister, Helen. Helen was eventually sent to a religious prep school, and Jack to an orphanage. Daisy remarried in 1941 to a man named John Earl King, making her Daisy King. But Jack wouldn't live with her for the rest of his childhood, which he spent going back and forth between the orphanage and living with other relatives. He ran away from the orphanage several times to be with his mother, but was always returned. In April 1948, when Jack was 16, he used forged ID papers to join the Coast Guard, where he stayed until January 1949. Despite only having a 9th grade education, he was admitted to Denver University and somehow granted a diploma before enrolling, though I'm not sure how that worked. In 1951, Jack was employed as a payroll clerk at a manufacturing concern. In March, he stole several blank checks from the company and filled them out. He cashed the checks, bought a truck with some of the money, and fled in it. He was on the run for 6 months before being caught in Texas in September. He was charged there with hauling whiskey in violation of Texas law and served 60 days in county jail before being taken back to Colorado to face sentencing for the forgery charges. In Colorado, Jack was told to pay over $3,000 in restitution. That's when Daisy, who hadn't done much for her son up to this point, came to the rescue. She agreed to pay part of the restitution and begged the judge to go easy on Jack. He ended up sentenced to 5 years probation. At some point that year, Jack's truck was run over by a train, though he did get a nice insurance payout for it. And things weren't all bad for Jack. He married a woman named Gloria in 1953, and the couple went on to have 2 children. He worked as an equipment mechanic from January 1953 to December 1954. But then things slowly began to go downhill again, and they would only get worse. Jack's stepfather, John Earl King, died in 1954. Daisy and Helen, who had been living in Florida at the time, moved back to Denver in February 1955. Jack and Gloria had just had their 2nd child, and Daisy had bought a house for them the previous year, which she also lived in upon returning to Colorado. It's not entirely clear how Jack lost his job in December 1954. But by 1955, the man who hadn't lived with his mother since he was a toddler and who had been on his own since he was 16 now found himself living with and financially dependent on her. In the spring of 1955, Daisy opened up a restaurant with the intention of letting Jack work there. But the restaurant wasn't a huge success. Jack would later say that the business did well when he was able to operate it, but it was a struggle. Early on, vandals did damage to the property. Then, in September of that year, there was an explosion at the restaurant. When investigators showed up at the scene, they found that there was a small amount of money missing from the register, and some of the furniture had been damaged. Police thought it might be arson, but couldn't prove anything. The explosion was ultimately determined to be accidental, caused by a gas leak. At this point, the restaurant had been losing money, and Daisy wanted to sell it, but Jack, who would have no job or income if this happened, disagreed. Helen would later say that her brother had pent-up violence, that she didn't think he was mentally sound and didn't particularly like to be around him. He was also violent. One incident left Helen with injured ribs after Jack knocked her down and kicked her in the chest. He also threatened to hit her with a hammer once, but she locked herself in a room to escape. One day in the summer of 1955, Jack woke up from a nap and couldn't find his wife, Gloria, anywhere. He finally found her playing cards with Helen and Daisy and grew so enraged that he backhanded her several times. Daisy would later say she was afraid he might hit her too. But Daisy had problems of her own. Helen claimed her mother could never really be happy or satisfied with anything. She wasn't very warm and loving, even insisting that Jack and Helen call her Daisy rather than Mom. She had severe mood swings and even attempted suicide at least once. In November 1955, Daisy planned a trip to Alaska to visit grandchildren there. She had a seat on United Airlines Flight 629, which was scheduled to leave Stapleton Airfield in Denver at 6:30 p.m. on November 1st. Sometime earlier that day, Jack brought Daisy a package wrapped in paper and said it was a Christmas present. Daisy packed it along with the rest of her luggage. At 5 p.m. that day, Jack drove Daisy to the airport. Upon their arrival, Jack used a vending machine to buy 3 separate life insurance policies, all on Daisy. He was the beneficiary of one, and Helen and Daisy's sister were the beneficiaries of the other 2. The one he was the beneficiary of was the most expensive. He paid $1.50 for it, and the payout was worth about $37,000. The other 2 would pay about $6,000 each. Daisy was one of the few passengers to check luggage. When a worker told her her suitcase was too heavy, she was given 2 options. She could pay an extra fee or unpack it and ship some of the things by freight. Jack stepped in and told his mother not to open the suitcase and to pay the extra fee, saying it would be easier. Flight 629 took off at 6:52 p.m., headed for a stop in Portland before reaching its final destination in Alaska. Jack would later say about his mother's flight, "I watched her go off for the last time. I felt happier than I ever felt before in my life." Around 7:03 p.m., residents of nearby Longmont, Colorado, reported seeing flashing lights and hearing an enormous crash. Seats with bodies in them fell from the sky and buried themselves in the ground of a sugar beet farm just outside the city. The body made indentations in the ground, some as deep as 8 inches. In addition to beets, potatoes had also been grown there. But for years to come, a local farmer would find airplane parts, as well as other debris from the crash, every time he tried to dig. The 44 people on board Flight 629, 39 passengers and 5 crew members, were all killed. For many of the passengers, it had been their first and last flight. The oldest passenger was 81. There was also a pregnant woman on board, 22-year-old Carol Bynum. She and her husband Brad were returning home after celebrating their first anniversary. Their original flight had been canceled, and they had subsequently been placed on Flight 629. But the story I find especially heartbreaking is that of the youngest passenger on board, 13-month-old James Fitzpatrick II. James was traveling to Japan with his mother to visit his father, who is in the Navy. It was the first time James's father would be seeing his son since he had been born. At the time Flight 629 crashed, air travel was still young. United Airlines had been working hard to promote it, hoping to convince passengers to choose airplane travel over train travel. Airplanes had crashed before this, but Flight 629 would turn out to be different. At first, investigators thought the crash was an accident, but when they found copper wire on board that seemed to suggest there was dynamite on the plane, they grew suspicious. But who could have bombed Flight 629? Investigators were baffled. There was nobody particularly famous on the plane, nobody who could have been the target of an assassination. They examined every possible lead or angle they could think of, looking into disgruntled customers and employees, the backgrounds of the victims, and passengers who canceled at the last minute or were scheduled to be on the plane but never showed up. They pulled the records from the life insurance kiosks at the airport and interviewed the families of the victims, but all of this ultimately led to nothing. It wasn't until they looked into the checked bags that they finally got a break. Of the 39 passengers, only 3 had checked any luggage. Only 1 suitcase had been potentially heavy enough to hold a bomb, and it was more damaged than any other piece of checked luggage. That suitcase belonged to Daisy King. The FBI sent 2 agents to interview Jack and Helen. At first, they thought that Daisy, who had suicidal tendencies, might actually be responsible, but that suspicion didn't last for long. Jack's behavior after the crash is especially interesting. According to a neighbor they interviewed, Jack hadn't been able to eat or sleep after the crash, and had spent most of his time wandering inside and outside around the house. However, the neighbor also told investigators she'd overheard Jack speaking lightheartedly to his wife and sister about how the shotgun shells Daisy had packed with her were going off in the plane every which way. Jack was also the first relative of a victim to call the United Airlines office after the crash. When the official who answered the call told him everyone on board was presumed dead, Jack reportedly responded, "Well, that's the way it goes." Half an hour later, the official called back, realizing he needed more information from Jack. When Gloria answered the phone, she told them her husband was upstairs, fast asleep. Upon searching his house, investigators found a newspaper clipping about his 1951 forgery charges. They also found wires that matched the ones in the bomb that took down Flight 629, and they were also able to track down a man who said he had sold Jack the dynamite. Jack also initially told investigators he'd bought the cheapest insurance policy, but that turned out to be a lie. And in addition to that $37,000 payout, he was also set to inherit the restaurant and an additional $150,000 from Daisy. 12 days after the crash, investigators sat down to interview Jack again. When confronted with the evidence, he quickly broke down. One day in the fall of 1955, Jack and Daisy had yet another argument while working at the restaurant. Jack, who had been abandoned by his mother as a child, now had to deal with her as both his landlord and his boss. At this point, all the resentment and anger that had festered toward her over the years finally boiled over. Jack assembled the bomb himself, making sure there was a timer built in so it would detonate in the air. He made sure to take Daisy to the airport at the last minute, and once he dropped her off, went off by himself to park. Once he was alone in the car around 6 p.m., he started the bomb's timer. Once inside the airport, he purchased the life insurance policies and convinced Daisy to pay the extra luggage fee so she wouldn't open the suitcase and the bomb wouldn't detonate right then. And this wasn't it. He also confessed to causing the explosion at the restaurant in December and to leaving his truck on a train track, causing it to be destroyed so he could collect the insurance payout. The day after his confessions, Jack Graham was arrested. At the time, there were no federal laws against bombing an airplane because it had never happened before. Flight 629 was, in fact, the first airplane sabotage in U.S. history. On November 17th, Jack was charged with first-degree murder in the death of his mother. He pled innocent by reason of insanity before, during, and after the alleged commission on the crime. He was evaluated by court psychiatrists and found to be legally sane and, therefore, fit to stand trial. There is one silver lining in this case that I feel is worth mentioning. Flight 629 was scheduled to leave at 6:30 p.m., but didn't take off until almost half an hour later. If it had left on schedule, it would have crashed into the mountains of Wyoming, and determining the cause of the crash would have been next to impossible. Jack Graham may never have been caught. His trial began on April 16, 1956. Hundreds of people lined up in the hallway outside the courtroom, hoping to get seats. Author Andrew J. Field would later call it the O.J. Simpson trial of its day. The case went to the jury on May 5th. They were out for just over an hour before returning with the verdict. Jack Graham was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his mother and sentenced to die by the gas chamber. Later that year, President Eisenhower signed a bill into law making it illegal to bomb an airplane. On the evening of January 11, 1957, a 24-year-old Jack Graham made his way to the gas chamber. Just before his execution, he said, "As far as feeling remorse for these people, I don't. I can't help it. Everybody pays their way and takes their chances. That's just the way it goes." He was pronounced dead at 8:08 p.m. It took him 11 minutes to die, the same amount of time that Flight 629 was in the air before it crashed. The story of Flight 629 was featured in the 1959 movie, The FBI Story. Based on the book by Don Whitehead, the movie's protagonist is an FBI agent who tells the story of the Bureau via separate incidents they were involved in. In 1993, the band Macabre released their album Sinister Slaughter. The album featured the song There Was a Young Man Who Blew Up a Plane, which was about Jack Graham. The album also had songs about Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Mary Bell, who I've talked about in a video before. The band also has a song about Ed Gein and an entire album about Jeffrey Dahmer. The case has also been the subject of at least 2 nonfiction books. One is a historical true crime short, Mass Murder in the Sky, The Bombing of Flight 629 by R. Barry Flowers. The other one I found was Mainline Denver, The Bombing of Flight 629 by Andrew J. Field, who I mentioned earlier. New York Times bestselling author Karen White also used the case as inspiration for her novel The Sound of Glass, though the plot goes in a bit of a different direction. When I first heard the story of Jack Graham, I found it as bizarre as it is tragic. Why did he set out to kill dozens of strangers who never hurt him when his major problem was with only one person? In February 1956, he tried to strangle a fellow prisoner and was put in a straitjacket and under 24-hour surveillance. When evaluated by a psychiatrist after this, the subject of the bombing came up. Jack told the psychiatrist he didn't care how many people he would have killed that day, saying, "When their time comes, there is nothing they can do about it." He then said it was a relief to confess this because he'd been feeling guilty about it. Jack was also said to have been inspired by Albert Gay, who bombed a Canadian flight in 1949 with the intention of killing his wife. I'm no psychiatrist, so this is pure speculation on my part. But maybe Jack's problems went far beyond his mother. Perhaps there was something in him all along, whether caused by genetics or upbringing, that drove him to kill. So, what are your thoughts on Jack Graham and his crimes? Let me know in the comments. Keep in mind that while I think stories like this are important to share for the sake of awareness, I don't mean to scare anyone. Your chances of dying in any sort of mass killing are exceedingly rare, and you shouldn't let fear stop you from living your life. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.